The morning sun barely broke through the gray clouds hanging over the city as people began gathering outside the Grand Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. Everyone was dressed in black, and the mood was heavy with sadness. They were all here to say goodbye to Victoria Ashford, who had passed away just 3 days ago at the age of 68. Victoria was not just any ordinary person. She was a billionaire who had built her fortune from absolutely nothing. She started as a young woman working 2 jobs just to pay rent and slowly climbed her way up until she owned one of the biggest companies in the country. People knew her name, they knew her story, and today over 1,000 people had come to pay their respects inside the cathedral. The atmosphere was thick with grief. The high ceilings made every whisper echo, and the smell of white lilies filled the air. At the front of the church sat a beautiful mahogany casket covered in flowers inside. That casket was supposed to be Victoria. Her son David sat in the front row with his wife Linda beside him. David was in his early 40s with graying hair at his temples, and he kept his face stern and emotionless. Linda held his hand, but her eyes kept darting around the room as if she was waiting for something. A few seats away sat Margaret, who was Victoria's younger sister. Two had not spoken in 15 years after a bitter argument about family matters that no one really talked about anymore. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes with a tissue and stared at the casket with a mixture of sadness and regret. She had wanted to make peace with her sister, but now it seemed too late. The priest stood near the altar, preparing his notes for the eulogy. He had known Victoria for many years and had watched her donate millions to help build schools and hospitals. He cleared his throat and was about to begin speaking when something unexpected happened. From the side entrance of the cathedral came a sound that made everyone turn their heads. It was the sound of hurried footsteps echoing on the marble floor. An elderly woman appeared from one of the side rooms. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and she was the janitor who had been working at this cathedral for over 40 years. Rosa was 72 years old, with silver hair tied back in a bun and deep lines on her face that told stories of a long, hard life. She wore her simple work uniform, and her hands were trembling. Her eyes were wide with panic, and she was moving faster than anyone had seen her move in years. Rosa rushed down the aisle past the rows of surprised mourners. She was pointing at the casket, and her voice broke the sacred silence of the moment. She was alive. Rosa screamed with her voice cracking with emotion. I saw her fingers move. She is alive, and there the entire congregation froze for a moment. No one moved or spoke. They all just stared at this elderly janitor who had interrupted the funeral with such an outrageous lame. Then the whispers started. People began talking to each other in hushed, confused tones. Some thought Rosa had lost her mind. The others wondered if this was some kind of sick joke. David stood up from his seat, and his face turned red with anger. He looked at Rosa with fury in his eyes. "What are you doing?" he demanded while walking toward her. "This is my mother's funeral. How dare you come in here and disrespect her memory like this? You need to leave right now." Rosa did not back down. Despite being much older and smaller than David, she stood her ground. Her body was shaking, but her voice was firm. "I know what I saw," she insisted, with tears beginning to stream down her weathered face. "Was cleaning the room next to the altar, and I walked past the casket to check if everything was ready. When I looked at her, I saw her finger move. It was small, but I saw Edie have been working here for 40 years, and I have seen hundreds of funerals. I know the difference between my imagination and reality. Please, you have to believe me." The funeral director, a tall, thin man named Gregory, stepped forward. He was sweating and clearly uncomfortable with the situation. It organized thousands of funerals in his career, and nothing like this had ever happened before. Gregory tried to calm everyone down. He assured David and the other family members that this was probably just a misunderstanding. Rosa was getting older, and perhaps her eyes had played tricks on her. Maybe she saw a shadow or the movement of the flowers. These things happen sometimes, especially in emotional situations, but Rosa would not be silenced. She grabbed Gregory's arm and looked into his eyes with desperation. "I am not confused," she said firmly. "I may be old, but I know what I saw. That woman in the casket moved her finger. If you do not check right now, and I am right then, you will be burying someone alive. Do you want that on your conscience?" Those words hit Gregory like a punch. The Color drained from his face as he realized the weight of what Rosa was saying. If there was even the smallest chance that she was right, then they could not proceed. The legal and moral implications would be devastating. Priest, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped forward. He was an older man with kind eyes, and he had always respected Rosashi, had cleaned the cathedral faithfully for decades, and had never caused any trouble. He had also heard stories about people being mistakenly declared dead. It was rare, but it happened. Priest looked at David and then at the casket. He took a deep breath. It made a decision that would change everything. I think we should check, the priest said quietly but firmly. If Rosa is wrong, then we can proceed with the service and apologize for the disruption. But if there is any possibility that she is right, then we have a moral obligation to look. We cannot take this risk. David's face became even redder. He stepped closer to the priest, and his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. This is absurd, he hissed. My mother is dead, the medical examiner confirmed. We have a death certificate. This woman is clearly disturbed, and you are all enabling her delusions. My mother deserves to be laid to rest with dignity, not turned into a circus. Shalinda stood up and placed her hand on David's shoulder. She whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head violently. Margaret also stood up, but her reaction was different. She looked at Rosa with hope in her eyes. If there is any chance, Margaret began with her voice trembling, any chance at all that my sister is alive, then we must check. I would rather look foolish than live with the regret of not knowing. Please. David let them open the casket. David turned to look at his aunt with disbelief. Could not understand why everyone was taking this janitor seriously, but he was outnumbered. The crowd was murmuring, and many people were nodding in agreement. They wanted to know the truth. Gregory, the funeral director, realized he had no choice. He called over his two assistants, and they slowly approached the casket. The organ music had stopped, and the cathedral was now completely silent, except for the sound of footsteps. So everyone in the church held their breath as Gregory's hands moved to the casket. Ladrosa stood nearby, with her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Tears continued to roll down her cheeks. She knew what she had seen, and she prayed that she was right. If she was wrong, she would be humiliated in front of all these people. She might even lose her job, but if she was right, she would save a life. That was all that mattered. Gregory looked at the priest one more time, as if asking for final confirmation. The priest nodded slowly and carefully. Gregory began to open the lid. The hinges creaked slightly in the quiet space. More and more of the casket's interior became visible. People in the front rows stood up to get a better look. Those in the back craned their necks. The lid opened fully, and everyone stared at Victoria Ashford lying peacefully in white silk. For a moment, nothing happened. She looked exactly as one would expect. Her face was pale, and her eyes were closed. Her hands were folded across her chest. David let out a bitter laugh. You see, he said loudly, she is dead. This has been a complete waste of time and a disgraceful interruption of my mother's funeral. But then someone in the front row gasped. It was Margaret, who had moved closer to look at her sister. She was staring at Victoria's face with wide eyes. Her eyelids, Margaret whispered. They just moved. I saw them flutter. Gregory leaned in closer to examine Victoria. He had been doing this job for 30 years, and he knew what a dead body looked like. But as he watched, he saw something that made his heart skip a bit. Victoria's chest was moving. It was barely noticeable, so slight that it could easily be missed, but it was there. A tiny rise and fall. She is breathing, Gregory said in a shocked voice that echoed through the cathedral. My God, she is breathing. The cathedral erupted into chaos. People started shouting, and some screamed. Others pulled out their phones to call for help. Rosa collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief. She had been right. Victoria was alive. Within seconds, someone called emergency services. The dispatcher could hardly believe what she was hearing, but she immediately sent an ambulance. David stood frozen in place. His face had gone from red to completely white. Linda grabbed his arm, but he seemed unable to move or speak. The priest quickly cleared people away from the casket to give Victoria space. Gregory and his assistants carefully checked for a pulse. It was there, faint and slow, but definitely there. How is this possible? Someone in the crowd asked. She was declared dead 3 days ago. How could she still be alive? No one had an answer. All they knew was that Victoria Ashford who had been lying in a casket ready to be buried, was somehow still breathing. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics rushed into the cathedral with their equipment and immediately began assessing Victoria. They checked her vital signs and started an IV line. Her condition was critical. She was severely dehydrated, and her body was in a state that mimicked death so closely that it had fooled the medical examiner. One of the paramedics explained that it might be a rare condition where the body's functions slow down to almost nothing. It could be caused by certain medications or medical conditions. Whatever the reason, Victoria needed to get to a hospital immediately. They lifted her onto a stretcher and wheeled her out of the cathedral. The crowd parted to let them through. News cameras that had been set up outside to film the funeral of a prominent billionaire now captured something completely different. They filmed the ambulance doors closing with Victoria inside, still alive against all odds. Rosa watched the ambulance drive away with its lights flashing. She was exhausted and emotionally drained, but she felt a deep sense of peace. She trusted her instincts and spoken up even when everyone doubted her hand. Because of that, a life had been saved. The cathedral slowly emptied as people filed out in shock and confusion. They had come to a funeral, but had witnessed a miracle instead. David and Linda left quickly without speaking to anyone. Margaret stayed behind and found Rosa sitting in one of the pews. The older woman approached the janitor and took her hands. "Thank you," Margaret said with fresh tears in her eyes. "Thank you for being brave enough to speak up. You gave my sister a chance to live. You gave me a chance to make things right." With her, Rosa smiled weakly. "I just did what anyone should do," she said softly. "Saw something wrong, and I could not stay silent." That a while she thought about how close they had come to burying Victoria alive. She thought about how easily her voice could have been ignored, and she thanked God that she had the courage to scream when it mattered most. Outside, the story was already spreading across the city and soon the world. The billionaire who came back from the dead, the janitor who saved her life, and the funeral that would be remembered forever. The ambulance raced through the city streets with its sirens blaring and lights flashing inside. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Victoria. Her pulse was dangerously weak, and her blood pressure was barely registrable. They radioed ahead to the hospital emergency room to prepare for a patient in critical condition. When they arrived, doctors and nurses rushed out to meet them. The head of the emergency department, Dr. Helen Carter, had been briefed on the situation, but she still could not quite believe what she was hearing. A woman who had been declared dead 3 days ago was now being brought in alive. It seemed impossible. They wheeled Victoria into the trauma bay and immediately began running test blood work, imaging scans, and constant monitoring of her vital signs. Dr. Carter examined Victoria carefully. The woman's skin was cold and pale. Her breathing was so shallow that it was almost undetectable without equipment. Her heart rate was dangerously slow, but she was alive. "How did this happen?" one of the younger doctors asked, while setting up an IV line. Dr. Carter shook her head. "I have read about cases like this, but I have never seen one in person. It appears to be catalepsy. It's a rare condition where the body enters a state that mimics death. The muscles become rigid, breathing slows to almost nothing. The heart rate drops so low that it can barely be detected to anyone without the right equipment. It would appear that the person has died, but why was not it caught earlier?" the nurse asked, while checking Victoria's blood pressures. Someone should have noticed. Dr. Carter's face was grim. "That is what we need to find out. A proper examination should have revealed signs of life, Evan. In catalepsy, there are usually indicators if you know what to look for." Someone made a very serious mistake as the medical team worked to stabilize Victoria. Word of what had happened spread through the hospital like wildfire. Nurses whispered about it in the hallways. Doctors discussed it in the break room, and within an hour the media had gathered outside the hospital demanding answers. The hospital's public relations team was overwhelmed with calls from news stations around the world. Meanwhile, in the waiting room, several people had gathered. Rosa, the janitor, had insisted on coming to the hospital even though she had no official connection to Victoria. She sat in a corner chair with her hands folded in her lap. She was exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, but she needed to know if Victoria would survive. Margaret sat near. She had not left her sister's side since the ambulance arrived. Every A few minutes she would ask a nurse for updates, but there was little information to share. Victoria was stable, but still unconscious. The doctors were doing everything they could, David and Linda arrived at the hospital about an hour later. They walked into the waiting room, and the atmosphere immediately changed. David's face was still pale, and his eyes were red. He looked like a man in shock. Linda stayed close to him and kept glancing around. Nervously, Margaret stood up when she saw them. Her expression was a mixture of relief and suspicion. "How could this have happened?" Margaret asked, while approaching her nephew. Mother was examined by a medical professional. She was declared dead. How did no one notice she was still alive? David did not answer. Immediately, he slumped into a chair and put his head in his hands. "I do not know," he finally said in a hollow voice. "The doctor said she was gone. Checked her and signed the death certificate. We trusted him, who was the doctor." Margaret pressed, "Was it her regular physician?" David shook his head. "No, her regular doctor was out of town. We called Dr. Raymond Piercy. He's an old family friend. He came to the house and examined her. He said her heart had stopped and that she was gone away. Had no reason to doubt him." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Raymond Piercy? Have not heard that name in years. How did you even know to call him?" David looked uncomfortable. "He and I had reconnected recently. Helped me with some medical questions about Mother's condition. When we found her collapsed, I panicked and called him because I knew he would come quickly before Margaret could ask more questions. A doctor emerged from the treatment area. Everyone in the waiting room stood up. The doctor was Dr. Carter, and she looked tired but focused. She addressed the small group. "Victoria is stable for now. Darkata began. We have her on for fluids and medications to support her heart and blood pressure. She is severely dehydrated and malnourished, which suggests she has been in this state for several days. Her body is slowly responding to treatment, but she is not out of danger yet." "Will she wake up?" Margaret asked with hope in her voice. "We do not know yet. Carter admitted her brain activity is present, which is a good sign, but we need to run more tests to understand the extent of any potential damage. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical." "Can we see her?" David asked quietly. "Not yet." "Yet, dear," Carter replied. "She needs rest and we need to monitor her closely. I will let you know when she is ready for visitors." As Dr. Carter turned to leave, Margaret called out to her, "Doctor, what caused this? How could someone in her condition be mistaken for dead?" Carter paused and chose her words carefully. "That is something we are investigating. Based on her symptoms, it appears she experienced a cataleptic episode. This is an extremely rare condition that can be triggered by certain medications, neurological issues, or other medical conditions. When someone is in this state, their vital signs can become so faint that they are nearly impossible to detect without proper equipment. However, a thorough medical examination should have caught this. Whoever declared her dead either did not perform adequate tests or missed critical signs." Margaret glanced at David. "So, you were saying the doctor who examined her made a mistake?" "Serious one." Dr. Carter confirmed. "We will be reviewing the case, and the hospital will likely be involved in an official investigation. I suggest you contact the medical examiner's office as well. They will want to know how a death certificate was issued in error." After Dr. Carter left the waiting room, fell silent. Rosa remained in her corner watching the family dynamics unfold. She noticed how Linda kept whispering to David. How David avoided making eye contact with Margaret. How tense the atmosphere had become. Something felt wrong, but Rosa could not quite put her finger on its hours passed slowly. The sun set, and the hospital lights seemed even harsher against the darkness. Outside, nurse brought coffee and sandwiches for those waiting, but no one had much appetite. Around 10 o'clock that evening, a woman in a business suit entered the waiting room. She introduced herself as Detective Rebecca Walsh from the City Police Department. She had been assigned to investigate the circumstances surrounding Victoria's near burial. "I need to ask some questions," Detective Walsh said while pulling out a notebook. "This is a very unusual situation, and we need to understand exactly what happened." She started with David, since he had been the one to find Victoria and call the doctor. David recounted the story. He had gone to visit his mother at her mansion 3 days ago. When he arrived, he found her collapsed in her bedroom. She was Not breathing and had no pulse, he immediately called Dr. Pierce, who arrived within 30 minutes. The doctor examined Victoria and declared her dead, he said. It appeared to be cardiac arrest, which was consistent with her known heart condition. Did Dr. Pierce use any equipment to verify death? Detective Walsh asked. David frowned, trying to remember. I think he used a stethoscope. He listened to her heart and checked for breathing. He also checked her pupils. It seemed thorough at the time. Did he suggest an autopsy? The detective pressed no. David said slowly. He said that given her medical history and age, an autopsy was not necessary. He offered to sign the death certificate right away to make things easier for us. And you did not question this? No, David admitted. We were grieving. We trusted him. He has been a doctor for over 30 years. Why would we doubt his judgment? Detective Walsh made notes and then turned to Margaret. Did you last see your sister alive? Margaret's voice was sad. 15 years ago, we had a falling out over family matters. I regretted deeply. I only learned of her supposed death when David's assistant called me to inform me of the funeral arrangements. I came immediately, but I thought I was too late. The detective asked a few more questions, then said she would need to speak with Dr. Pierce. She also wanted to review Victoria's medical records and interview the hospital staff before she left. She looked at Rosa, who had been sitting quietly the entire time. You are the janitor who discovered she was alive? Detective Walsh said. Yes, Rosa replied softly. I'm just glad I spoke up. Your quick thinking saved her life. Detective said kindly. I will need to get your statement as well, but it can wait until tomorrow. You should go home and rest. Rosa nodded, but she did not move. She wanted to stay until she knew Victoria would be okay. Midnight approached. A nurse came out with an update. Victoria had regained some color, and her vital signs were improving. She was still unconscious, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic. Margaret felt relief wash over her. David sat motionless, staring at the floor. Linda excused herself to make some phone calls. Next morning brought even more shocking developments. Detective Walsh returned with news that made everyone's blood run cold. She had spoken with Dr. Raymond Pierce, and something about his story did not add up. The doctor claimed he had performed a thorough examination, but when pressed on the details, his account became vague and inconsistent. More troubling was what the detective had discovered when she looked into Dr. Pierce's background. The doctor was in serious financial trouble. He owed over $200,000 in gambling debts. His medical practice was struggling, and he had recently been investigated for insurance fraud, though no charges had been filed. Why would David call a doctor with such a questionable background, though? Detective also found something interesting in Victoria's financial records. She had scheduled a meeting with her lawyer for the week she supposedly died. The purpose of the meeting was to revise her will. According to the lawyer's assistant, Victoria had mentioned she was planning to make significant changes. Wanted to leave the majority of her fortune to charitable organizations rather than to family members. This information cast David in a very different light. If his mother changed her will, he would lose billions of dollars, but if she died before making those changes, the old will would stand, and David would inherit everything. Detective Walsh confronted David with these findings. At first, he denied knowing anything about his mother's plans to change her will, but when pressed, he admitted that Victoria had mentioned it to him in passing. She said she wanted to do more good in the world. David explained defensively. I thought she was just talking. I did not think she would actually cut me out. And the payment you made to Dr. Pierce the morning after your mother was declared dead? Detective asked. What was that for? David's face went white. How did you know about that? Bank records. Detective Walsh said coldly. You transferred $50,000 to Raymond Pierce's account. Care to explain why? It was for his services. David stammered. He came on short notice, and I wanted to compensate him $50,000 for a house call. The detective's voice was sharp. That is quite generous, unless you were paying him for something else. David stood up suddenly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. Want a lawyer? He said. I am not answering any more questions without legal representation. Linda also stood looking panicked. Detective nodded. That is, you're right, but I should inform you that Dr. Pierce is being brought in for questioning as well, and I suspect he will be very interested in making a deal to reduce his own charges. He might have a lot to say about your arrangement. As David and Linda rushed out of the hospital, Detective Walsh turned to Margaret Ty. Think your nephew may have been involved in a plot to kill your sister, or at the very least to ensure she died without medical intervention. We are still gathering evidence, but the picture is becoming clearer. Margaret sat down heavily. She felt sick. Her own nephew had potentially tried to murder Victoria for money, yet was too horrible to comprehend. Meanwhile, in the intensive care unit, something remarkable was happening. Victoria's eyes slowly began to open. At first, everything was blurry and confusing. Did not know where she was or what had happened. Nurse noticed immediately and called for Dr. Carter. Welcome back, Dr. Carter said gently, while leaning over Victoria. You are in the hospital. You have been very sick, but you are safe now. Victoria tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The nurse gave her small sips of water slowly. Victoria's awareness returned. She remembered feeling ill. She remembered collapsing, but after that everything was blank. Where is David? Victoria whispered. Her voice was barely audible. Our Carter exchanged a glance with the nurse. He was here earlier, the doctor said carefully, but right now you need to focus on recovering. There will be time for everything else later. But Victoria's sharp mind was already working. Even in her weakened state, she sensed something was wrong. What happened? Dinesh asked. Why am I here? Dear Carter took a deep breath and decided Victoria deserved to know at least part of the truth. You were very ill. You fell into a rare state that made you appear deceased. You were nearly buried alive. It was only because a janitor at the cathedral noticed you were still alive that you were saved. Victoria's eyes widened in shock and horror. I was almost buried. Dear Carter confirmed, but you are safe now, and we are going to make sure you recover fully. As Victoria processed this information, one thought kept running through her mind. If she had appeared dead, who had declared her so, and why had they not been more careful? She had a terrible feeling that the answers to these questions would change everything over the next 3 days. Victoria's condition continued to improve. She was moved from intensive care to a private room where she could rest more comfortably. Her body was recovering from the ordeal, but her mind was racing with questions. Margaret visited every day, bringing flowers and sitting by her sister's bedside. The two women who had not spoken in 15 years found themselves reconnecting through quiet conversations. At first they talked about small things, the weather outside, the kindness of the nurses, the terrible hospital, food, but gradually they began to address the elephant in the room. Margaret. I need to know what happened, Victoria said one afternoon, while struggling to sit up in bed. How did I end up in a casket? Who declared me dead? Margaret hesitated. She had been dreading this conversation, but she knew Victoria deserved the truth. It was David. Margaret began slowly. He found you collapsed in your bedroom. Called a doctor named Raymond Pierce, who examined you and declared you deceased. The funeral was arranged very quickly, too. Quickly, in my opinion. Victoria's face darkened. Ramon Pierce, I have not seen him in years. Why would David call him instead of my regular physician? That is what the police are trying to figure out. Margaret admitted there is an investigation underway. David and his wife Linda have both hired lawyers. They are not talking to anyone. Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Tell me everything's. Margaret did. She explained about Rosa, the janitor who had saved Victoria's life. She told her about the interrupted funeral and the chaos that followed. She described the medical findings and the detective's discoveries, and finally she revealed what the investigation had uncovered about David's financial situation and the planned changes to Victoria's will. Victoria listened in silence. With each new piece of information, her expression grew harder. When Margaret finished, Victoria sat quietly for a long moment. Then she spoke in a voice that was calm, but filled with steel. My own son tried to kill me, not necessarily. Margaret said quickly. The police do not have proof yet. Maybe it was just negligence. Maybe the doctor made an honest mistake. Victoria shook her head. $50,000 is not payment for an honest mistake. That is payment for silence, or payment for a job done. Margaret did not argue. She had thought the same thing. A knock on the door interrupted them. Detective Walsh entered with a folder under her arm. She looked tired but determined. Miss Ashford, the detective said, I'm glad to see you are recovering. I need to ask you some questions if you are feeling up to it. Victoria nodded. I want to know everything. Please sit down. Detective Walsh pulled up a chair and opened her folder. Let Me start by telling you what we have discovered, Dr. Raymond Pierce has been taken into custody. Initially denied any wrongdoing, but when we showed him the evidence, he began to crack. Pierce admitted that David had contacted him the night before you were found. David told him that you were very ill and asked if Pierce would be willing to come to the house if needed. Pierce thought nothing of it at the time, but then the next morning David called in a panic saying you had collapsed. When Pierce arrived at your mansion, you were indeed unconscious. David was there along with his wife. They seemed very distressed. Pierce examined you and found that you had almost no detectable pulse. Your breathing was so shallow he could barely measure it. Your body was cold. By all appearances, you seem to have passed away. However, Pierce admitted that he did not perform as thorough an examination as he should have. He did not use an EKG machine. He did not check your blood oxygen levels. He relied mainly on a stethoscope and visual inspection. He said he assumed it was cardiac arrest. Given your age and medical history, why would he be so careless? Victoria asked. The detective's expression was grimby, because David offered him money. A lot of money. David knew Pierce was in financial trouble. He knew the doctor was desperate, so he made Pierce an offer $50,000 to sign the death certificate quickly and without too many questions, to avoid recommending an autopsy to make everything smooth and fast. Pierce swears he genuinely believed you were dead. He says he would never have signed the certificate otherwise, but he also admits that the money influenced him to not be as careful as he should have been. He did not ask hard questions. He did not insist on additional tests. He just did what David wanted, so David manipulated him. Victoria said quietly. He exploited a desperate man to get what he needed. His detective Walsh confirmed, but it gets worse. We also investigated what happened in the hours before you collapsed. Household staff reported that you had dinner alone that evening. The cook prepared your meal and left it in the kitchen as usual. You ate by yourself in your study. The next morning, David arrived and found you unconscious. We had the contents of your stomach analyzed. The hospital kept samples when you were first admitted. What did you find? Victoria asked, though she already suspected the answer. Traces of medication, the detective said specifically. A combination of sedatives and muscle relaxants, in doses much higher than any prescription you had. Someone put those drugs in your food. The drugs induced a state that mimicked death combined with your underlying health conditions. It created the perfect storm. You appeared dead, but your body was actually in a kind of suspended state. If you had been buried, you would have died within hours from lack of oxygen. If you had been found in time as you were, you could potentially recover. Victoria felt a chill run through her body, so it was attempted murder. We believe so, Detective Walsh said. The drugs were administered deliberately. The quick declaration of death was arranged in advance. Rushed funeral was meant to dispose of the evidence before anyone could question what happened. If not for the janitor, who noticed you were still alive, the plan would have succeeded perfectly. Who had access to my food that night? Victoria asked. According to your staff, the cook prepared the meal and left it covered in the kitchen around 6 p.m. She then went home for the evening. The security cameras show that David entered the house using his key about 30 minutes later. He went into the kitchen and was there for approximately 10 minutes. Then he left. A few hours after that, you ate the meal, and soon after you collapsed. David was alone in the kitchen. Margaret whispered he could have put anything in the food. The detective nodded. We searched his home and found a bottle of prescription sedatives that matched the drugs in Victoria's system. They were prescribed to Linda for anxiety, but she claims she rarely uses them and did not know they were missing. Linda is cooperating with Ushi. Seems genuinely shocked by what David did. She claims she knew nothing about his plans. Do you believe her? Victoria asked honestly. I am not sure yet. Detective Walsh admitted she may have been willfully ignorant. She benefited from David's inheritance, so she had motive, but we have not found direct evidence linking her to the crime. David, however, is a different story. We have the financial records showing his debts. We have testimony from your lawyer about the planned will changes. We have the payment to Dr. Pierce. We have the security footage and the toxicology reports. The case against him is strong. What happens now? Margaret asked. We have arrested David on charges of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Dr. Pierce is being charged with medical malpractice, fraud, and being an accessory. Both are currently being held without bail. We will continue to gather evidence and build the case for trial. Victoria sat back against her pillows. She looked smaller, somehow older and more fragile than before. My own son, she said softly. Gave him everything. I built an empire so he would never struggle the way I did, and he tried to kill me for money, Margaret. Took her sister's Hondi. I'm so sorry, Victoria. Squeezed her sister's hand, but did not cry. She had already done her crying now. She felt only a deep sadness and a cold anger. I want to see him. Victoria said suddenly, I want to look him in the eye and ask him why. Do not think that is a good idea. The detective began a need. To Victoria, insisted I need to understand how my son became capable of this. Please arrange it, detective. Walsh looked uncertain, but she nodded. I will see what I can do, but it will have to be at the jail, and it will be monitored. Victoria agreed. 2 days later, Victoria was strong enough to leave the hospital in a wheelchair. Margaret accompanied her to the county jail where David was being held. They were led to a small visiting room with a glass partition on the other side. David sat in an orange jumpsuit. He looked terrible. His hair was messy, and his eyes were red and hollowing. He saw his mother alive and staring at him through the glass. His face crumpled. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Victoria picked up the phone and waited for David to do the same with Victoria. Ask, that was all she said. Just one word, but it carried the weight of a mother's betrayal. David's hand shook as he held the phone. His voice came out broken. And Smalley was drowning. He said the company was failing. I made bad investments. Owed money to people who do not forgive debts. I needed the inheritance. I needed it desperately so. You decided to kill me. Victoria's voice was ice. You poisoned my food. You had me declared dead. You were going to bury me alive, all for money. David's tears flowed freely. Now, I did not think you would suffer, he sobbed. The drugs were supposed to be painless. You would just fall asleep and then it would be over. Dr. Pierce said you were gone. I believed him. I swear, I thought you were already dead when we planned the funeral, but you gave him money to not look too carefully. Victoria said you made sure he would not find out the truth. You wanted me in the ground before anyone could question what happened. I panicked. David cried after Pierce signed the certificate. I realized what I had done, but I could not take it back. I thought if we just went through with the funeral quickly, no one would ever know. I never wanted you to wake up in that casket. I never wanted you to suffer like that. Victoria's expression did not change. But you did want me dead. Yes, David whispered. God help me. Yes, I wanted you gone so I could have the money to save myself. I'm a monster, I know that now, but I was. Desperation does not excuse murder. Victoria said. I gave you everything, a home, an education, a position in my company, and when you failed, I did not abandon you. I tried to help you learn to grow, but you only saw me as an obstacle between you and money. David looked at his mother with devastation in his eyes. I am sorry, he said. I know that does not mean anything now, but I am so sorry. I wish I could take it back. I wish I had died instead of putting you through this. Victoria stood up slowly. With Margaret's help, she looked at her son one last time. You are not my son anymore, she said quietly. The boy I raised would never have done this. You are a stranger to me now. You will pay for what you have done. I will make sure of it. She hung up the phone and turned away behind the glass. David collapsed, sobbing, but Victoria did not look back. Margaret wheeled her out of the jail and into the waiting cars. They drove back to the hospital. Victoria stared out the window. The city passed by in a blur of lights and movement. Life continued all around her. People going about their days, unaware of the darkness that could exist in families and aware of how greed could corrupt even the bonds between parent and child. That night, back in her hospital room, Victoria could not sleep. She kept thinking about everything that had happened, about how close she had come to death, about the betrayal of her own son, and about the janitor who had saved her life. Rosette, that was her name. Victoria had learned everything about a woman who had spoken up when no one else would. Droza had worked at the cathedral for 40 years. She lived in a small apartment and took care of her 3 grandchildren. She had very little money, but a wealth of courage. I want to meet her, Victoria told Margaret the next morning. The woman who saved my life. I need to thank her properly. Margaret smiled. I will arrange it. Droza arrived at the hospital that afternoon. She was nervous and kept smoothing down her simple dress. She had never met anyone as wealthy or powerful as Victoria, but when she entered the room, Victoria greeted her with genuine warmth. Please sit down, Victoria said, gesturing to the chair beside her. Rosa sat carefully, She looked at the woman she had saved and felt a surge of emotion. "I'm so glad you are alive," Rosa said softly. "When I saw you in that casket, I just knew something was wrong." "Could not stay silent. You saved my life," Victoria said. "You risked embarrassment and possibly your job to speak the truth that takes incredible courage most. People would have stayed quiet." Rosa shook her head. "I just did what was right." "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Victoria corrected her gently. "Not anyone. Most people would have doubted themselves. They would have worried about making a scene, but you trusted your instincts and you acted. That is extraordinary." The two women talked for over an hour. Victoria learned about Rosa's life, her journey to this country, her years of hard work, her dreams of returning to healthcare. Rosa had once been a nurse's aide before immigrating, but she had never been able to reclaim her credentials in her new home. So she had worked as a janitor and raising her family and supporting her grandchildren. "What if I could help you?" Victoria asked. "What if I could help you get back into healthcare? Help your grandchildren with their education? Would you let me do that?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "I did not save you for a reward, I know," Victoria said, "but I want to do this not as payment, but as a way of honoring what you did. You gave me my life back. Let me help give you your dreams back." Rosa nodded. Unable to speak, the two women held hands, connected by a moment of courage that had changed both their lives forever. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting, casting golden light across the city, and somewhere in a jail cell, David sat alone with his guilt while his mother planned not for revenge, but for justice and for a future built on gratitude rather than greed. Days following Victoria's confrontation with David brought unexpected changes. News of the interrupted funeral and the attempted murder had spread across the world. Every major news outlet wanted to cover the story, though. A billionaire who almost got buried, alive with a son who tried to kill his mother for money, and the humble janitor who saved a life. Reporters camped outside the hospital hoping for interviews. Victoria refused to speak to any of them. She was not ready to turn her near death into a media spectacle. But Rosa was a different story at first. Rosa also refused interviews. She was a private person who had never sought attention, had simply done what she thought was right, and wanted to return to her quiet life. However, the media found her. Anyway, they discovered where she lived and learned about her story when reporters showed up at her small apartment building. Her neighbors were shocked to learn that the elderly woman who cleaned the cathedral was now famous. One persistent journalist named Patricia finally convinced Rosa to sit down for an interview. Patricia was different from the others. She did not just want a sensational story. She wanted to understand who Rosa really was. They met in a small coffee shop near Rosa's home. Rosa was nervous at first. Her hands trembled as she held her cup of tea. But Patricia put her at ease with gentle questions and genuine interest. "Me about that moment in the cathedral," Patricia asked. "What made you look closely enough to notice Victoria was alive?" Rosa thought back to that day. The memory was still vivid in her mind. "I have been cleaning that cathedral for 40 years. She began. I have seen hundreds of funerals, maybe even 1,000 after so many years. You develop a sense for these things. I was preparing one of the side rooms when I walked past the casket. Something made me pause. I cannot explain it exactly. Maybe it was the way the light fell on her face, or maybe it was just instinct, but I looked closer, and that is when I saw her finger move just a tiny twitch, so small that anyone else might have missed it. But I had worked as a nurse's aide many years ago. Before I came to this country, I was trained to notice small signs, a slight movement, a change in color, anything that might indicate life. So when I saw that finger move, I knew I had to act. "Evan, though you risked being wrong," Patricia said. "Evan, though people might have thought you were crazy." Rosa nodded. "Yes, I thought about that for a moment. I wondered if I should just stay quiet. If I was mistaken, what if I embarrassed myself in front of all those people? I could lose my job. People would think I was a foolish old woman. But then I thought, what if I am right? What if that woman is alive and I say nothing? I would be responsible for her death. I could not live with that. So I screamed." I made a sigh. "Did not care what people thought of me. Life was more valuable than my pride." Patricia wrote notes, but she was also clearly moved. "What happened after they took Victoria to the hospital? Did anyone thank you?" "Not at first. Rosa admitted everyone was in shock. The family left quickly. The other mourners did not know what to say to Mitha. Funeral director was upset because of the disruption. I just went back to my work, cleaned up the cathedral. As I always doed, it was not until the next day that Margaret came to find Mesh, thanked me, and told me that Victoria was going to survive that. It was all the thanks I needed. The interview continued for another hour. Rosa talked about her life, about coming to this country with nothing but hope, about working multiple jobs to support her family, about losing her daughter to illness and taking in her 3 grandchildren, about going to night school in secret because she dreamed of returning to healthcare. Someday when the interview was published, it touched millions of people. Rosa's humility and courage resonated with readers everywhere. The story was shared thousands of times on social media. People called her a hero. Bet what happened next was even more surprising. Donations started pouring in. Complete strangers from around the world wanted to help the woman who had saved Victoria's life. They sent money for Rosa's education, for her grandchildren's college funds, for a better place to live. Within a week, over $1 million had been donated. Rosa was overwhelmed. She had never imagined anything like this. She cried when she saw the total amount. It was more money than she had earned in her entire life of working. But Rosa, being who she was, immediately started thinking about others. She set aside funds for her grandchildren's education, put money toward finishing her nursing certification, and then she did something that surprised everyone. She donated a large portion to a fund that helped other immigrant healthcare workers reclaim their credentials. I am not the only person who has struggled with this, Rosa has told Patricia in a follow-up interview. There are thousands of doctors and nurses from other countries who come here and cannot practice. They end up doing other jobs even though they have the skills to save lives. If this money can help them, then Victoria's life was saved twice, once by me and once by all the people who believed in doing good. Meanwhile, Victoria was recovering steadily. Her body was healing, but her heart was broken. The betrayal by David had cut deeper than any physical wound. Margaret stayed by her sister's side through it all. 2 women who had wasted 15 years in silence now made up for lost time. They talked about their childhood, about their parents who had passed away long ago, about the argument that had driven them apart. It seems so stupid now, Margaret said one afternoon, fighting over something I cannot even remember. Clearly we lost so many years over. Pride. Victoria not a die was stubborn. I always had to be right, Devon, when being right meant being alone. I'm sorry I pushed you away. I'm sorry, to Margaret replied. I should have tried harder to reconcile, but I was angry and hurt. I let that anger last far too long. They held hands in comfortable silence. Sometimes the most important words were the ones left unspoken. Victoria grew stronger. She began to think about the future. Her company needed attention, her finances needed to be reorganized, and she had a promise to keep too. Rosa, Victoria's lawyers, worked on getting her affairs in order. Well, that David had tried to prevent was now going to be executed, but Victoria made changes. She was more determined than ever to use her wealth for good. She called a meeting with her financial advisors and lawyers. Want to establish a foundation, Victoria announced. Stay, large one, dedicated to helping people like Rosu, people who have the skills and desire to serve but face barriers. We will help immigrant healthcare workers. We will fund education programs. We will support those who have been overlooked. How much are you thinking of allocating? Her chief financial advisor asked. Victoria did not hesitate. $500 million to start. The room went silent. That was a massive amount, even for someone of Victoria's wealth, but she was serious. Rosa saved my life. Not because she wanted anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do that. Kind of characters Rarai want to honor it by helping others. Like Harar. You sure about this? One of the lawyers asked. What about your family? What about David's children, your grandchildren? Victoria's expression hardened. David will inherit nothing he attempted to murder. Me, whatever he might have received, will go to the foundation instead. As for his children, they are young and innocent in all of this. I will set up trust funds for their education, but they will not have access to vast wealth that could corrupt them as it did their father. They will have to learn to work and earn their way in life. And Margaret. Victoria turned to her sister. I want you to be co-chair of the foundation with Mif. You will accept? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I would be honored. Over the next few weeks, the foundation took shape. They decided to name it the Rosa Martinez Foundation. When Victoria told Rosa about this, the older woman protested. You cannot name it after me, Rosa Sadai. Am nobody special. That is exactly why we are naming it after you, Victoria replied, because you represent everyone who has been told they are nobody special, everyone who has been overlooked, everyone who has more to give than the world has allowed them to give. You are the perfect symbol for what we want to achieve. Rosa said finally agreed, though she remained humble about the whole thing. The Foundation's first initiative was to create a program that helped immigrant healthcare professionals navigate the complex process of getting their credentials recognized. They provided funding for required courses, translation services for foreign documents, legal help with immigration paper, or canned mentorship from established healthcare workers. Though response was overwhelming, within the first month over 2,000 people applied for assistance. Many of them had stories similar to Rosa's: doctors working as taxi drivers, nurses working as house cleaners, skilled professionals whose talents were being wasted because of bureaucratic barriers. Victoria threw herself into the work. It gave her purpose during a difficult time. Instead of dwelling on David's betrayal, she focused on creating something positive. She met with program participants, heard their stories, celebrated their successes when they passed their certification exams. One day, a woman named Amara came to thank Victoria. Personally, Amara had been a surgeon in her home country, but when she came to the United States, her credentials were not recognized. She spent 10 years working in a factory, while her skills went unused. Now, thanks to the Foundation, she had passed all her exams and was about to start a residency program. You gave me back my identity, Amara told Victoria with tears in her eyes. For 10 years, I felt like I was nothing. Like all my education and experience meant nothing. But now I can practice medicine again. I can save lives again. You have given me back my purpose. Victoria hugged the younger woman. Stories like these made everything worthwhile. As the weeks turned into months, the legal case against David moved forward. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution had the toxicology reports, the financial records, the testimony from Dr. Pierce, who had agreed to testify against David in exchange for a reduced sentence. David's lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Victoria refused to agree to anything lenient. Sure, wanted a trial. She wanted the truth to be spoken publicly. Sure, wanted the world to see what greed could do to a family. The trial began on a cold morning in late autumn. The courthouse was packed with reporters and curious onlookers. Victoria attended every day of the trial. She sat in the front row with Margaret beside her. She wanted David to see her, to be reminded every single day of what he had done and how he had failed. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the jury the financial records proving David's debts. They presented the security footage of David entering the house the night Victoria was poisoned. They had experts testify about the drugs found in Victoria's system. Dr. Pierce took the stand and admitted his role. He explained how David had exploited his financial desperation, how the money had clouded his judgment, how he had failed to perform a proper examination because he wanted to believe David's version of events. The courtroom was silent as Pierce described the moment he realized Vilman might still be alive when news of the interrupted funeral reached him. He said he vomited from the horror of what he had almost been part of. David's defense team tried to argue that he had not intended to kill his mother. The drugs were meant only to make her sick, that he had believed Dr. Pierce when the doctor said she was dead. But the prosecution demolished this argument. They pointed out the large dose of drugs, the rushed funeral arrangements, the payment to Dr. Pierce to avoid questions. Everything pointed to a calculated plan to kill Victoria and inherit her fortune. When it was time for victim impact statements, Victoria took the stand. The courtroom was absolutely silent as she walked to the witness box. She looked directly at David as she spoke. My son tried to kill me, Victoria began her The voice was steady but filled with pain, not in a moment of passion or rage, but through careful planning. He poisoned my food. He arranged for a corrupt doctor to declare me dead. He planned to bury me alive, all for money. She paused, letting those words sink. Eni gave him life. I raised him. I loved him. I built a fortune so he would never struggle as I hadn't. He repaid me by trying to end my life. Betrayal is something I will carry forever. No mother should have to fear her own child, but I will not let this destroy me. Instead, I choose to honor the person who saved Mirosa Martinez. Risked everything to speak the truth. She had no money, no power, no reason to get involved except that it was the right thing to do. She represents the best of humanity, while my son represents the worst. I will spend the rest of my life supporting people like Rose, and I will make sure my son faces full justice for what he has done. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. They found David guilty on all counts. Murder, fraud, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. As the sentence was read, David broke down crying. He looked at his mother one last time, but Victoria's face showed no emotion. She had already mourned the loss of her son. This was simply the ending of a sad chapter. Linda was sentenced to 5 years for her role in not reporting her suspicions. Dar Pierce received 10 years for his part in the scheme outside the courthouse. Victoria spoke briefly to the press. Justice has been served, as she said simply. Now, I want to focus on the future, on building something good from this tragedy and honoring the courage of ordinary people who do extraordinary things. With that, she walked away from the camera as she had said all she needed to say. The next day, Victoria and Margaret visited Rosa at her new home. The donations had allowed Rosa to move into a comfortable apartment in a better neighborhood. Her grandchildren had their own rooms. Now there was space for Rosa to study. When Victoria arrived, Rosa greeted her with a warm hug. They sat together drinking tea and talking about the foundation, about Rosa's progress in her nursing program, about the lives that were being changed. This is what matters, Victoria said quietly. Not the money or the company or any of it. This helping people, making a difference, creating good in the world. Rosa smiled. You have created something beautiful from something terrible that takes strength. Victoria shook her head. No, you showed me what real strength is. You stood up when no one else would. You trusted yourself when others doubted. You saved not just my life, but my faith in humanity. We'll always be grateful for that. As the sun set that evening, Victoria felt something she had not felt in months. Peace. The betrayal still hurt. It probably always would, but she had found purpose again. She had reconnected with her sister. She had met an extraordinary woman who reminded her what truly mattered on. She was using her resources to help others. That was enough. That was more. Then Nof outside Rosa's apartment building, children played in the courtyard. Their laughter drifted up through the open window. Victoria listened to that sound and smiled. Life continued. People loved and struggled and hoped, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, someone like Rosa would be there to save you when you needed it. Most 6 months after the trial, life had settled into a new rhythm. Victoria was fully recovered from her ordeal. Her body had healed, and though the emotional scars remained, she had learned to live with them. She threw herself into running the Rosa Martinez Foundation with the same energy she had once devoted to building her business empire, but now her motivation was different. She was not chasing profit or prestige. She was chasing purpose. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What started as a program to help immigrant healthcare workers had expanded into something much larger. They now offered support for anyone who had skills but faced barriers to using them: veterans struggling to transition to civilian careers, single parents trying to go back to school, formerly incarcerated individuals seeking a second chance. The foundation helped them all. Margaret worked alongside her sister every day. The two women had become inseparable. They made up for the 15 years they had lost by being present for each other. Now they had lunch together every afternoon. They reviewed grant applications side by side. They visited program participants and heard their stories. One morning they were in the foundation office when Rosa arrived for a meeting. Rosa was now the foundation's director of healthcare initiatives. She had completed her nursing certification with the foundation's help and was using her experience to guide others through the same process. She walked into the office with confidence that had not been there. 6 months ago, she wore professional clothes instead of her janitor's uniform, but she still had the same warm smile and humble spirit. "Good morning," Rosa said while placing a folder on Victoria's desk. "I have the quarterly report on our healthcare program. The numbers are incredible. How many new certifications?" Victoria asked. 87 this quarter, Rosa replied with pride in her voice. 7 healthcare professionals who can now practice in their fields. Doctors, nurses, physical therapists, all of them were working in jobs
Did not use their skills.
now they can serve their communities. Margaret smiled. That is 87. Lives changed, but also thousands of patients who will benefit from their care. Exactly, Rosa said. That is what I love about this work. The impact multiplies. Person we help goes on to help so many others. As they reviewed the report, Victoria noticed something. "Rose, this shows you have been working 70-hour weeks. That is too much. You need to take care of yourself." Rosa waved her hand dismissively. "Am fine there. So much work to do. Will rest when I am dead." Victoria and Margaret exchanged a look. Those words hit differently given what they had all been through. Rosa realized what she had said and covered her mouth. "Oh, I am sorry. I did not mean it." "It's all right," Victoria said with a gentle smile, "but I am serious. You need balance. We all do. This foundation will be here for many years. It is not a sprint. It is a marathon." Rosa, "No to do all right. I just get so excited about the work there. So many people to help." "I know," Victoria said, "but you cannot help anyone if you burn yourself out. Take some time off. Spend it with your grandchildren they miss." Rosa agreed. Reluctantly, she still had trouble accepting that she deserved rest. Years of working multiple jobs had conditioned her to believe that stopping meant falling behind, but she was learning later that day Victoria had a visitor she was not expecting. The receptionist called her offices. "Ashford, there is someone here to see you, a young woman named Hannah. She says she is your granddaughter." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. Hannah was David's oldest daughter. She was 19 years old and had been away at college when everything happened. Victoria, not seen her since before the trials. "Send her in," Victoria said when Hannah walked into the office. Victoria saw so much of herself in the young woman. Hannah had Victoria's dark eyes and determined chin, but she also looked nervous and uncertain. "Grandmother," Hannah said quietly, "thank you for seeing May." "Was not sure you would have." "Of course," Victoria replied while standing to embrace her. "You are always welcome. Here, sit down, please." Hannah sat on the edge of the chair. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "I have wanted to visit for months," she began, "but I did not know what to say. My father tried to kill you." "How do I apologize for that? How do I even face you? You are not responsible for your father's actions," Victoria said firmly. "You did nothing wrong." "No," Hannah whispered, "but I feel guilty anyway. Keep you thinking I should have seen something, some sign that he was capable of this. But he was just my dad. He took me to school and helped with my homework and came to my soccer games. I never imagined he could do something so evil." Victoria moved to sit beside her granddaughter. She took Hannah's hand. "Your father made terrible choices driven by greed and desperation, but that does not erase the good parts of who he was to you. You are allowed to love the father you knew while still condemning what he did." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "I am so ashamed. Everyone knows what he did. People at school look at me differently. Some avoid. Mothers ask intrusive questions. I feel like I am carrying his guilt." "You are not," Victoria said gently. "You are your own person who get to write your own story. Yes, your father's actions are part of your history, but they do not define you." Hannah wiped her eyes. "What he did to you? What he almost did. He cannot stop thinking about it. Too could have died. He was going to bury you alive. How do you live with that? How do you forgive?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That was a complicated question. Honestly, I have not forgiven him," she admitted. "Maybe someday I will, but right now the wound is still too fresh. What I have done instead is choose not to let his actions poison the rest of my life. I could spend every day being angry, being bitter, being afraid, or I can spend my days doing good, helping others, building something meaningful." "Chose the second option." Hannah nodded slowly. "The foundation have been following the news. What you are doing is amazing. Would you like to see it?" Victoria asked. "The actual work we do?" Hannah's face brightened. Really, yes, Victoria. Stood and extended her hand. Come with me. They spent the next 2 hours touring the foundations. Programs. Victoria introduced Hannah to participants whose lives had been transformed. They met Chen, who had been a computer engineer in his home country and was now working for a major tech company. They met Fatima, who had been a teacher for 20 years before immigrating and was now running her own tutoring center. They met Jerome, who had served in the military and was now training to be a paramedic. Each person had a story of struggle and perseverance. Each one had been given a chance by the foundation. Hannah listened to every story with rapt attention. By the end of the tour, she was smiling genuinely for the first time since arriving. This is incredible, Hannah said. You are changing so many lives. Victoria smiled. We are trying, but there is always more work to do, more people to help. Hannah hesitated, then spoke. I want to help. I am studying business administration. I could volunteer. I could do whatever you need. Victoria looked at her granddaughter with warmth. I would love that, but only if you are doing it because you want to, not because you feel obligated. Die? Want to, Hannah? Insist to die. Need to do something good. Something that matters. My father took so much from you. I want to give something back. You do not owe me anything, Victoria said. But if you want to be part of this, if you want to contribute, then yes, I would be grateful for your help. Hannah started volunteering at the foundation the next week. She came in twice a week after her classes. She helped with administrative tasks. She assisted program participants with their applications. She listened to their stories and offered encouragement. Victoria watched her granddaughter bloom. The guilt and shame that Hannah had been carrying slowly lifted as she found purpose in helping others. One afternoon, Hannah was helping Rosa organize files when she asked a question that had been on her mind. Hannah began carefully. How did you forgive my father for what he tried to do to my grandmother? Rosa looked up from the filing cabinet. I did not have to forgive him, she said simply. He did not wrong me. He wronged your grandmother only. She can forgive him if she chooses to, but do not you hate him. Hannah Presti almost killed someone you care about. Rosa sat down and thought about her answer. Hate takes a lot of energy, she finally said. Energy I would rather spend on better things. Your father made terrible choices. He will live with the consequences. But hating him does not help anyone. It does not help your grandmother. It does not help you, and it certainly does not help me. So, instead, I choose to focus on what good came from this situation. I met your grandmother, who became a dear friend, helped start this foundation which is changing lives. I got to return to the work I love. I spend my time hating your father. I miss all of that. Hannah was quiet for a moment. I wish I could be like that, she said. I wish I could let go of all the anger and guilt. Rosa smiled. You are young. You have time to learn, and you are already doing the work. Being here, helping others, that is how you let go, not all at once, but slowly, day by day. As the months continued, Hannah became a regular presence at the foundation. She changed her major to nonprofit management. She started talking about making this her career. Victoria could not have been more proud. Meanwhile, the foundation continued to grow. They opened satellite offices in 3 other cities. They partnered with hospitals and universities. They were approached by the government to help develop national policies for credential recognition. Victoria was asked to speak at conferences and universities. She told her story not to gain sympathy, but to illustrate the importance of listening to unlikely voices. In every speech, she talked about Rose, about how a janitor with no power or prestige had saved her life because she trusted herself and spoke up. The cathedral where it all happened installed a permanent plaque. It reads simply, in this place, Rosa Martinez saved a life by having the courage to speak the truth. May we all be so brave. Rosa attended the unveiling ceremony. She stood in front of the plaque and cried, not because she wanted recognition, but because she hoped her story might inspire others to speak up when it mattered. 2 years after the interrupted funeral, Victoria organized a special event. It was the foundation's anniversary celebration. Over 500 people attended. Program graduate, staff members, donors, community partners gathered to celebrate what they had built together. Victoria stood at the podium. To give the opening remarks, she looked out at the crowd and saw so many faces she had come to note 2 years ago. I was lying in a casket, Victoria. Began about to be buried alive. Had been betrayed by someone I loved, poisoned and left for dead, but I was saved by a woman who had every reason to stay silent, who had nothing to gain by speaking up, who risked embarrassment and her livelihood to tell the truth. Rosa Martinez taught me that real wealth has nothing to do with money. Real wealth is courage, integrity, compassion. The willingness to do what is right even when it is hard. She paused and looked directly at Rosa, who was sitting in the front row. Because of Rosa, I got a second chance at life, and I have tried to use that second chance to honor her example. This foundation exists because one person cared enough to act, because one person valued a stranger's life more than her own comfort. Is the spirit we try to embody in everything we do. The crowd erupted in applause. Rosa stood and waved. Shyly, she still was not comfortable with attention, but she had learned to accept it gracefully. After Victoria's speech, several program graduates spoke. They shared how the foundation had changed their trajectories, how it had given them hope when they had none, how it had recognized their worth when society had overlooked them. Then it was Rosa's turn to speak. She walked slowly to the podium. Her grandchildren sat in the front row, beaming with pride. I am not good at speeches, Rosa began with a nervous laugh. Am better at mopping floors, but I want to say something. When I came to this country, I had dreams. I wanted to help people. I wanted to use my skills to make a difference. But life got in the way. I had to work. I had to survive. I had to take care of my family. My dreams got smaller and smaller until they were just about making it through each day. Then one day I saw something that did not seem right, a finger moving in a casket hand. I had a choice. I could ignore it and protect myself from embarrassment, or I could speak up and possibly save a life. I chose to speak up, not because I am brave, but because I could not live with myself if I stayed silent. She looked at Victoria. What I did not know was that speaking up would change my life. To it would give me back my dreams, would show me that it is never too late to become who you were meant to be. I am 74 years old, and I just became a registered nurse. Ginny thought that door was closed forever, but Victoria opened it. She saw value in me when I had stopped seeing it in myself. So to everyone here, if you have dreams that seem impossible, if you feel like society has put you in a box, if you think it is too late to does not speak up, step forward, take the chance, because you never know what might happen when you have the courage to try. The applause was thunderous. People stood and cheered. Rosa stepped away from the podium with tears streaming down her face. After the formal program ended, people mingled and shared stories. Victoria found herself standing near the window watching the scene. Margaret joined her. This is beautiful, Margaret said. Look at what you have built. We built it together, Victoria corrected all of us. Every person in this room contributed something. I just provided the resources. Rosa provided the inspiration, and everyone else did the actual work. Margaret, mild mother, would have been proud father too. Always believed in helping others. Victoria nodded. I wish they could see this. I think they can, Margaret said somehow. I think they know. As the evening wound down, Victoria stood to give closing remarks. Thank you all for being here, she said. Thank you for believing in this mission. Thank you for your hard work and dedication. 2 years ago I almost died, but instead I got to live in, not just exist, but truly live with purpose and meanings, surrounded by people who inspire me every day. That is a gift I will never take for granted. So let us continue this work. Let us continue helping people recognize their own worth. Let us continue giving second chances. Let us continue building a world where everyone has the opportunity to use their gifts, because that is what Rosa did for me, and that is what we can do for countless others. As people filed out, Victoria stayed behind with Rosa and Margaretha, 3 women who had been brought together by tragedy, who had built something beautiful from pain. They sat together in comfortable silence. No words were needed. Outside, the city lights twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere David sat in a prison cell. Somewhere Linda tried to rebuild her life. Somewhere Dr. Pierce served his sentence. But here in this room there was only peace. Victoria had learned that betrayal could not destroy you if you did not let it, that tragedy could be transformed into purpose, that the smallest voice could change everything, and that real treasure was not measured in money, but in lives. Touched dreams restored, and courage honored, Rosa eventually stood to leave her. Grandchildren were waiting for her as she gathered her things. Victoria stopped her. Rosa, Victoria. I said I'd never get tired of saying this. Thank you for saving my life, for showing me what really matters, for being exactly who you are. Rosa hugged her friend. And thank you, Rosa replied, for seeing me, for believing in me, for giving me back my purpose. We saved each other. They both knew it was true. Sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it wore a janitor's uniform and spoke with a quiet voice. Sometimes it looked like an elderly woman who trusted herself enough to scream in a silent cathedral land. Sometimes, just sometimes, that was exactly what the world needed most. Victoria walked Rosa to her car. She waved as her friend drove away, and she stood under the stars for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, grateful for every grateful for second chances, grateful for Rosa, for Margaret, for Hannah, for everyone who had been part of this journey. Life was precious, life was short, life was worth fighting for, and thanks to one woman's courage, Victoria had the chance to live hers fully, with purpose, with meaning, with love. That was the greatest gift of all, and she would spend every remaining day honoring it. The city hummed around her, full of people with stories and struggles and dreams, full of potential, roses waiting to be discovered, full of lives waiting to be saved. Victoria smiled. There was so much work still to do, so many people to help, so many second chances to give on. She could not wait to get started, because that was what living was all about. Not the money or the power or the prestige, but the connections, the impact, the difference you made in the world. Rosa had taught her that, and Victoria would never forget it. She walked back inside, ready for tomorrow, ready for whatever came next, ready to live